Life on a quiet stretch of countryside often carried its own rhythm. The mornings began with the distant crow of roosters, the soft hum of cicadas, and the comforting sound of hooves tapping across gravel. On the edge of the town limits, away from the perfectly trimmed lawns and stiff regulations of suburban neighborhoods, stood a modest property, sturdy wooden fences enclosing wide patches of green pasture. This was the kind of land that still felt alive, shaped not by committee meetings or architectural guidelines, but by the sweat and grit of the people who lived on it. At the center of this little world stood a donkey. He was not particularly remarkable to those who only saw animals as creatures to be managed or tamed, but for his owner, he was a companion, a guardian of sorts, and above all, a symbol of freedom. His bray carried across the fields in the early morning, echoing down the road, where it inevitably brushed against ears that didn't appreciate it. Those ears belonged to a woman known to the community simply as Karen. Her name, of course, was something else, but it hardly mattered. What defined her wasn't her birth certificate, but her behavior. She was the type to believe rules were meant to serve her alone, the type who saw other people's property as obstacles to her own comfort. And unfortunately for her neighbors, she had moved into the countryside expecting it to operate like a suburban homeowners association. Karen drove a gleaming pickup truck, too polished for dirt roads, too fragile for the dust it often collected. She didn't own land large enough to justify such a vehicle, but appearances mattered more than practicality. To her, the countryside was less about living in harmony with the land and more about projecting an image of superiority. She wanted others to know she was there, to remind them that her presence meant something. The donkey, however, didn't care who she was. He brayed when he pleased, moved where he wished within the fences, and carried himself with the stubborn dignity that only such animals possess. To Karen, this was an insult. She complained about the noise, muttered about the smell, and fumed when she saw him standing near the fence line. She convinced herself that the donkey's very existence was an affront to her carefully crafted image of country living. Her irritation grew into obsession. Every morning when she left her driveway, she would slow her truck by the property line, staring at the donkey as though it were plotting against her. The more she stewed, the more convinced she became that the animal's owner was deliberately taunting her by keeping him there. In her mind, she was the victim of disrespect, and disrespect was something she couldn't tolerate. One afternoon, her patience snapped. She had spent the better part of her day polishing the chrome of her truck and complaining to anyone who would listen about how uncivilized her neighbor's property was. As she drove down the gravel road, she saw the donkey again, lazily flicking his tail and chewing on a patch of grass by the fence. That was all it took. Her anger boiled over, and she decided she would teach the animal a lesson. She rolled down her window and slammed her hand on the horn. The sound ripped through the air, sharp and relentless. Birds scattered from the trees, the gravel rattled under the truck's idle, and the donkey's ears twitched. He lifted his head, staring directly at the shiny vehicle, and for the first time, the roles reversed. Karen thought she was the intimidator, but the donkey saw something different. He saw a challenge. There was a stillness in that moment, the kind of pause before a storm that carries more weight than thunder itself. The donkey took a step closer to the fence, his hooves pressing into the dirt with deliberate force. His gaze locked onto the truck as though he understood the insult. Then, with no hesitation, he bolted forward. The fence rattled but held, yet the donkey didn't stop. He slammed his chest and shoulder into the boards, the impact echoing like a drumbeat across the quiet road. Startled, Karen leaned on the horn again, her pride refusing to yield. The donkey reared up, his front hooves striking against the wooden rails, and then he let out a bray so loud it seemed to shake the ground itself. Karen's truck trembled as her foot pressed harder on the gas pedal. Gravel spun beneath her tires, dust clouding the air. But the donkey didn't flinch. With a burst of power, he rammed into the fence once more, and this time the weakest plank snapped. The sound was sharp, like a crack of lightning, and Karen's confidence wavered. Instead of retreating, the donkey pushed forward, squeezing through the opening with surprising force. His hooves clattered onto the gravel road, and his eyes locked on the gleaming truck. Karen panicked. She slammed the truck into reverse, but the road wasn't built for panic. The rear wheels fishtailed, the truck lurched sideways, and before she could correct it, the donkey lunged. He struck the side of the truck with a force Karen had never imagined possible from such a creature. The impact was violent enough to jolt her against the seatbelt. The polished metal dented inward, the sound of crunching steel filling the air. Her pride, wrapped up in the shine of that truck, shattered in an instant. The force of the hit pushed the vehicle closer to the edge of the ditch that ran parallel to the road. Karen tried to steer away, but the momentum was against her. The tires slipped, the ground crumbled beneath the weight, and in the blink of an eye, her truck tipped sideways. With a final sickening lurch, it slid into the ditch, landing on its side with the tires spinning helplessly. The donkey stood above, breathing hard, his ears flicking with the satisfaction of victory. Dust rose around him, carried by the late afternoon wind, while Karen sat inside her ruined truck, stunned into silence. For the first time, she was the one left powerless. Word of the incident spread faster than wildfire. Neighbors whispered about the woman who thought she could scare a donkey and ended up with her truck in a ditch. Some laughed, others shook their heads, but all agreed on one thing. You don't challenge an animal born of stubborn strength and expect to win. But Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat. Humiliation fueled her anger, and as she climbed out of the wreckage, one thing became certain. This wasn't over. The battle between Karen and the donkey had only just begun. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the gravel road, the stage was set for a conflict that would drag the entire community into its orbit. The morning after the crash carried an uneasy stillness across the countryside. The ditch on the side of the road, which had always been little more than a shallow scar carved by rainwater, now bore a new mark, the twisted outline of Karen's truck. The once pristine vehicle sat tilted awkwardly in the mud, its paint scratched, its panels dented, and its prideful shine dulled under a layer of dirt. Neighbors slowed their cars as they passed, unable to resist the temptation of curiosity. For some, it was amusement, a story worth chuckling over as they carried on with their chores. For others, it was a quiet warning that Karen's feud with the donkey had gone from petty irritation to dangerous escalation. Karen herself was seething. Every scrape on her truck felt like a personal insult, every dent a wound to her reputation. She stood at the edge of the ditch that morning, arms crossed, glaring at the donkey grazing contentedly inside his pasture, as though nothing unusual had happened. To her, it was unbearable. She had been humiliated not just by an animal, but in full view of the community. That humiliation curdled into obsession. By the time a tow truck arrived to haul her wrecked vehicle out of the ditch, Karen had already begun constructing her plan. She would not allow this slight to go unanswered. She told herself that she wasn't the problem, the donkey was. And if no one else was going to do something about it, then she would. But in rural communities, word spreads faster than intention. While Karen plotted, her neighbors were already sharing the tale. They told it at the feed store, at the small diner by the highway, even at the gas station where strangers passing through caught snippets of conversation. Each retelling seemed to grow, painting Karen as the fool who thought she could scare a donkey with a horn, only to find herself thrown into a ditch. By the end of the week, Karen was no longer just a neighbor with complaints. She was a spectacle. Children whispered about the donkey defender, as though the animal were some kind of local folk hero. Adults shook their heads knowingly, some siding with the stubborn animal, others wondering how long it would be before Karen made things worse. Karen, of course, heard every word. The sideways glances at the grocery store, the smirks she caught when walking past groups of neighbors, it all fed into her determination. She couldn't let the story end this way. Her first step was paperwork. She marched down to the county office, slamming forms and complaints onto desks, demanding something be done about the dangerous animal next door. She exaggerated, claiming the donkey had leapt from its fence unprovoked, charging at her as though it were a wild beast. She spoke of property damage, of personal safety, of the sheer recklessness of keeping such a creature near her home. But rural officials had heard plenty of tales before, and they weren't so quick to side with her. The animal was fenced in. The road incident, by their accounts, was more the result of reckless behavior behind the wheel than the donkey itself. Her complaints were noted, but no action was taken. That only deepened her resentment. If the county wouldn't help her, she would escalate in other ways. She began knocking on doors, rallying neighbors, trying to convince them that the donkey posed a danger to everyone. She spoke of what could happen if it broke free again, weaving images of children at risk and cars destroyed. Yet most listened politely and closed their doors soon after. Some even chuckled once she was gone, seeing her crusade for what it was, a grudge born of bruised pride. The donkey, meanwhile, carried on with the indifference only an animal can muster. He brayed in the mornings, stomped his hooves in the dust, and grazed along the fence line, seemingly unaware of the storm brewing in the mind of the woman across the way. To him, the incident was already behind him. To Karen, it was only the beginning. Frustrated at the lack of support, Karen shifted tactics. If she couldn't rally allies, she would create an enemy in the shadows. Late one evening, long after the last of the day's light had drained from the horizon, she drove past the donkey's pasture once more. Her new truck, cheaper, less impressive but functional, rolled to a stop by the fence. She sat there in the dark, engine idling, staring at the animal illuminated faintly by the moonlight. The donkey stood calmly, his tail swishing lazily, his ears flicking in the night air. For Karen, the sight rekindled her fury. She gripped the steering wheel, teeth clenched, imagining the sound of dented metal, the laughter of neighbors, the whispers of mockery. She rolled down her window and slammed her palm against the horn again, long and hard. The sound shattered the quiet night, echoing across the fields. The donkey's head rose slowly, eyes reflecting faintly in the headlights. He brayed once, a deep, resonant sound that rolled through the still air, then stamped his hoof against the ground with authority. The message was clear. He wasn't afraid. Karen revved her engine, gravel spitting from the tires as she lurched forward slightly, closing the distance between her bumper and the fence. The donkey didn't move. Instead, he lowered his head, muscles taut, stance steady. He looked less like prey and more like a soldier guarding his ground. In that moment, Karen felt something she hadn't expected. Hesitation. She wasn't dealing with a frightened animal that would scatter at noise or movement. This donkey was stubborn, steady, and unshaken. The memory of twisted metal and the ditch came rushing back, and for a fleeting second, she considered letting go. But Karen was not someone who let go easily. Her pride wouldn't allow retreat. She pressed the horn again, longer this time, her frustration filling the night. Yet still, the donkey didn't move. Neighbors awoke to the noise, lights flicking on in distant windows. Curtains parted, eyes peered out into the darkness, and whispers began once again. Karen, realizing the attention she was drawing, finally backed her truck away and sped off into the night. By morning, the whispers had become another story. Not only had she wrecked her first truck trying to scare the donkey, but now she was harassing it in the middle of the night. Her reputation, already fragile, crumbled further under the weight of her own stubbornness. The donkey, as always, carried on unchanged. He was becoming something more than just an animal. To the community, he was a symbol of quiet defiance, a reminder that some things couldn't be bullied into submission. And for Karen, that reality was unbearable. Her obsession was no longer just about the truck, the ditch, or even the donkey itself. It became about control. Control she felt slipping through her fingers with every laugh, every whisper, every bray echoing across the countryside. As the days passed, it became clear that Karen wasn't done. She was planning something bigger, something she believed would finally tip the scales in her favor. And when she struck next, it wouldn't just involve the donkey. The entire community would be drawn into the conflict, whether they wanted to be or not. The lines were being drawn, and the battle was about to escalate. By the third week after the ditch incident, the countryside felt divided. On one side was Karen, clinging tightly to her outrage, convinced that she was the victim of an unruly animal and an uncooperative community. On the other side was almost everyone else who found themselves increasingly amused by or simply exhausted with her determination to turn a simple donkey into a menace. The whispers had turned into open jokes. At the feed store, someone pinned up a cartoon sketch of a donkey standing triumphantly over a flipped truck. At the diner, the waitresses began calling the morning special the stubborn mule breakfast, a jab not only at the donkey, but at Karen's refusal to let the matter go. The sheriff's deputy even made a passing remark when filling his coffee one morning, noting that the roads had been peaceful lately, unless a certain truck meets a certain donkey again. Each comment cut Karen deeper than she'd ever admit. Her attempts to control the narrative had failed, and in their place grew a story she couldn't stop. She had become the butt of the joke, the character people pointed at rather than listened to. That humiliation became her fuel, pushing her to escalate further. Karen's plan began quietly in the form of letters. She typed them late into the night, each one a carefully constructed complaint that exaggerated the donkey's behavior into something monstrous. In her words, he wasn't simply grazing peacefully in a pasture. He was a dangerous beast, a threat to children, a hazard to drivers, a ticking time bomb of destruction. She mailed copies of her complaint not just to the county office but to the sheriff, the animal control department, and even local news stations. For weeks, she waited, convinced that someone would arrive at her doorstep with news that the donkey was to be removed. But each reply was the same. The animal was fenced, healthy, and posed no real danger. Without evidence of repeated escape or violence, there was nothing they could do. That answer only hardened her resolve. If the authorities wouldn't act, then she would find another way. She began speaking more loudly at community meetings, interrupting discussions about roads and crops to launch into tirades about livestock laws and dangerous animals. She stood at the edge of the church potluck, muttering to anyone who would listen about that blasted donkey. Slowly, the line between nuisance and obsession blurred. And yet the donkey remained unchanged. Each morning his bray echoed across the fields as predictably as the sunrise. He moved along the fence, tail swishing, chewing grass with no awareness of the storm he had caused. Neighbors began to see him differently, not just as livestock, but as a kind of symbol. He was stubborn, yes, but steadfast. He was an anchor in a community where one woman's drama threatened to unravel the calm. It was then that Karen decided the matter couldn't simply rest with words. She wanted action, and she wanted it to be seen. She waited until a Saturday afternoon, when more people would be home, when the gravel road carried more than the occasional truck or tractor. She parked her new vehicle at the edge of the ditch, the same one where her old truck had met its end, and stepped out. Neighbors peered through windows as Karen dragged a series of signs from her truck bed. Each one was hand-painted with phrases scrawled in thick red letters. Dangerous animal ahead, protect your families, ban the donkey. She planted them into the ground like stakes in a battlefield, hammering them into place with theatrical vigor. Dust clung to her clothes, sweat streaked down her brow, but she kept at it, convinced that each sign brought her closer to victory. The donkey watched from his pasture, ears twitching as the hammer thudded against the dirt. At one point, he brayed loudly, the sound carrying across the fields. To Karen, it felt like mockery. She turned, glaring at the animal, muttering under her breath about how much longer the community would tolerate this madness. By evening, the road was lined with her signs. Neighbors emerged cautiously, some shaking their heads, others snapping photos with their phones. Children giggled, asking their parents if the donkey was really dangerous, only to be hushed with knowing smiles. The spectacle became yet another story for the community to share, another reason for laughter rather than fear. And then came the final straw. The following Monday, the local paper ran a short feature in the community notes section. It wasn't about Karen's signs nor about her complaints. It was about the donkey. The piece called him a surprisingly resilient animal and referenced the growing folklore of his standoff with Karen's truck. They even gave him a nickname, General Bray. The article was short, playful, and entirely at Karen's expense. When she saw it, her fury erupted. She crumpled the newspaper in her fists, shouting to an empty room about slander, about mockery, about how no one understood the seriousness of her situation. That night, she returned to the donkey's pasture under cover of darkness. Her truck headlights swept across the field as she pulled over. She stepped out, gripping a length of rope she had taken from her garage. Her plan was reckless, even dangerous, but in her mind it was justice. She intended to catch the donkey, drag him from the property, and prove to everyone that he was a menace unfit to live near her. But as she crept toward the fence, rope in hand, the donkey lifted his head. His ears flicked, his body stiffened, and his bray shattered the night air. The sound carried across the valley, echoing into the homes of neighbors who once again peered from their windows. Lights flicked on, dogs barked, and Karen froze. The donkey stomped forward, his hooves striking the dirt with deliberate force. He pressed his chest against the fence, the boards creaking under his weight. Eyes locked on the intruder. In that instant, Karen realized just how impossible her task was. She was one woman with a rope, facing an animal built from centuries of stubborn endurance. She backed away, fumbling with the rope, then scrambled to her truck. Tires spun in the gravel as she tore down the road, headlights cutting jagged lines through the dark. Behind her, the donkey stood unmoving, his bray carrying after her like a warning. By dawn, the neighbors had pieced the story together once again. The rope left by the fence, the tire marks in the gravel, the chorus of barking dogs, they all painted a clear picture. Karen's feud had crossed into something dangerous. The community was no longer simply amused. They began to talk seriously about her behavior, about her obsession, about whether something needed to be done, not with the donkey, but with her. Karen, however, was not finished. The humiliation, the mockery, the failure of her midnight plan, it all added to the fire burning inside her. She would not rest until she won, until the donkey was gone, until her pride was restored. And so she began to prepare for the most reckless act of all. The tension in the community had reached its breaking point. What began as a single confrontation between a stubborn woman and an even more stubborn donkey had now become a spectacle that consumed every porch conversation, every whispered remark at the diner, every quiet joke at the feed store. Yet beneath the laughter and gossip, there was unease. Karen's behavior was no longer simply embarrassing. It was unpredictable. The donkey had gained a reputation, a local legend status under the name General Bray. Children pretended to be him while playing, stamping their feet and letting out exaggerated brays. Teenagers posed for photos by the fence, pretending to be challenged by the animal. Adults, tired of Karen's antics, began to treat the donkey as a kind of folk hero, an unintentional defender of rural peace. Karen, meanwhile, had spiraled deeper. Each attempt she made to win against the donkey only made her look more ridiculous, and each failure only fueled her resolve. The failed rope incident left her reputation in tatters. Neighbors no longer viewed her as an annoyance. They saw her as unstable. Still, she refused to back down. She convinced herself that the only way forward was one final decisive act. No more complaints to the county, no more signs on the road, no more whispered threats in the night. She would show the entire community once and for all that the donkey was dangerous, and she would do it publicly. Her plan was reckless. She would stage a confrontation in broad daylight, forcing the donkey into a situation where he would lash out. With witnesses present, she believed, the county would have no choice but to declare him unsafe and remove him. It was the kind of plan born not of logic, but of desperation. The day she chose was a Saturday, when she knew families would be outside working their land, when the gravel road would carry more traffic, and when there would be plenty of eyes to see her victory. She parked her truck deliberately close to the pasture fence, engine humming, horn blaring until the donkey turned his head. The sound carried through the valley, drawing neighbors to their porches, their windows, their driveways. Everyone knew the story by now, and the sight of Karen parked by the fence was enough to make them watch closely. Some shook their heads, others laughed under their breath, but all waited to see what she would do. The donkey, calm as ever, stepped closer to the fence. His ears flicked, his eyes steady, his jaw working methodically as he chewed on a mouthful of grass. There was no fear in his movements, no nervousness in his stance. He was the very picture of defiance. Karen revved her engine, the truck snarling louder, gravel scattering beneath its tires. She leaned hard on the horn again, the noise splitting the air. The donkey stamped his hoof, brayed once, and moved closer still. The fence groaned under his weight as he pressed his chest against it. For a moment, time seemed to hang in suspension. Neighbors whispered, waiting, wondering. Then, with the stubborn force that had defined him all along, the donkey shoved against the fence, snapping another plank loose. The sound cracked like a gunshot, sending a ripple of excitement through the onlookers. Karen saw her chance. She slammed her truck into gear and inched forward, trying to provoke him into action. But instead of retreating, the donkey lunged. His hooves struck the ground like thunder as he burst through the weakened section of the fence, charging toward the gleaming vehicle. The impact was immediate and violent. His shoulder slammed against the truck's side with a metallic crunch, denting the door inward. Karen jerked in her seat, clutching the steering wheel as the vehicle rocked under the blow. Gasps and shouts erupted from the roadside where neighbors had gathered. But the donkey wasn't finished. He reared back, braying with the force of a war cry, then rammed the truck again. This time, the momentum carried it sideways, wheels skidding across the gravel. The truck teetered dangerously close to the ditch, the same ditch that had swallowed her first vehicle weeks before. Karen panicked. She slammed the accelerator, trying to pull away, but the road betrayed her once again. The tires spun wildly, gravel spitting uselessly as the donkey delivered one final shove. With a sickening tilt, the truck's front wheels slipped into the ditch, dragging the rest of the vehicle down until it landed on its side with a deafening crash. The scene exploded with chaos. Neighbors shouted, some rushing forward, others holding back in disbelief. Children pointed, wide-eyed, as the donkey stood above the wreckage, braying triumphantly, his chest heaving with effort. Dust filled the air, settling slowly over the battered truck and the stubborn animal who had brought it down. Karen crawled from the passenger side window, her clothes streaked with dirt, her face twisted with fury and humiliation. The community had seen everything. There was no spinning this story, no letters she could write, no complaints she could file. The evidence was undeniable. The sheriff's deputy arrived soon after, summoned by the flurry of phone calls that lit up as soon as the truck tipped. He listened patiently to the neighbors' accounts, each one painting the same picture. A woman provoking an animal until it defended itself. The donkey, calm now, stood inside his pasture once again, tail swishing as though nothing had happened. Karen tried desperately to argue her case, pointing at the dents, the broken fence, the wrecked truck. But the deputy shook his head, noting quietly that the damage had been the result of her actions, not the animal's. The donkey had only responded to her provocation. The final blow came when the county officials, tired of her constant complaints, issued a warning, not to the donkey's owner but to Karen herself. If she continued harassing the animal or endangering the community, she would face charges. The humiliation was complete. Her second truck lay battered in the ditch, her reputation reduced to a cautionary tale, her neighbors united not in fear of the donkey, but in laughter at her downfall. From that day on, the countryside returned to its natural rhythm. The donkey brayed in the mornings, stomped his hooves in the dust, and grazed peacefully by the fence. Neighbors carried on with their lives, occasionally retelling the tale of the stubborn animal who had twice sent Karen's truck into a ditch. The story grew into local folklore, passed down with a mixture of amusement and respect for the animal who stood his ground. As for Karen, her appearances became less frequent. She no longer lingered by the fence line, no longer honked her horn in the night. Her obsession, broken under the weight of her own pride, faded into silence. She remained in the community, but she was no longer feared, no longer listened to, no longer respected. In the end, the donkey hadn't just defended his pasture, he had defended the very spirit of the countryside. Stubborn, unyielding, and steady, he reminded everyone that not everything could be bullied, not everything could be controlled. Some things simply were, and in their defiance, they carried a strength that no amount of noise or arrogance could overcome. And so the tale of Karen and the donkey lived on, a story told on porches at sunset, in hushed laughter at the diner, in knowing glances whenever a truck rattled down the gravel road. A reminder that sometimes, in the simplest of battles, the most unlikely of heroes emerge.